Hello, everybody, and this is our last module for cognition, for our cognition unit. This module surrounds language and the development of language and how we think and how language influences the way we think and vice versa. Why language? Remember that within the mental abilities included in the concept of cognition, which involve these mental processes that include thinking, decision making, and it includes communication as well. And if we look at the definition of language, which is our way of combining words, and in order to communicate meaning, then we can understand how this is an essential topic for this unit. So more specifically, as you see in the slide, we will try to describe the components of language and how we acquire. This is part of the development that includes that next goal, which is to understand what a critical period means in development of language. It's a concept that actually applies to many other aspects of development, but for this one, we'll limit it to critical period. What is it, and why is it relevant to this field? We also discussed, this part also has some biology in it, and we will talk about the different brain areas that are involved in language processing and speech. And then an interesting discussion about the relationship between thinking and language, which is, as your textbook describes, sort of the chicken and egg story, one of the chicken and egg stories of development psychology. Which came first? This idea of do we think, and are our ideas basically conceived in words? Do we need to understand language in order to think? Or do we simply first have these thoughts and then label them with a word or with a phrase? So this is, of course, a discussion, and we'll talk about some theories that debate this topic. Please remember the definitions. In this upcoming exam, you will be required to define and apply these terms. And by definition, you may think you understand, but it is important that you use the testing effect for your reviewing of these definitions and seeing how close you are to these key terms that need to be included in each of them. So as we remember, the language for further processing, I'll read off the slide. In language, what is language? It's our spoken and written or signed words, and the ways we combine them in order to communicate meaning. And it's important to understand that language transmits knowledge from one generation to the next. Your textbook has an interesting discussion about how today, being in a culture in which we have so much access to mass media, the amount of knowledge that we have access to through language is much greater than the ones they had in 100 years ago, because we are constantly exposed to it and engaged in it as well. I also would like to add to this definition that it's a flexible system. It's important to see language as such, although there are theorists that would counter-argue this flexibility of language. I would say that the tendency is to agree that it is flexible, meaning it is malleable and it changes. It also allows us to, when we talk about communicate meaning, yes, but with meaning comes our ability to communicate also thoughts and feelings. What is language made of? We have three basic components: phonemes, morphemes, and grammar. And it's important that we understand the three of them. Now, you might be asking yourself, why is this relevant? Well, in order to understand how we acquire language and how we are affected by it in terms of how it influences our thoughts and behaviors, it is only natural to understand that it's important to know what's language made of. So, and this is going to make a little bit more sense, these terms, once we go over these processes through which we acquire language. So let's begin with phonemes. Phonemes are, it's important to understand that phonemes have no meanings. These are they're basically, they are the smallest basic sound units of language. In a way, I recommend you associate these is with the term phonemes, as in phone. We speak on the phone. So these are going to be phonemes refer to basic sound that we speak. I'm trying to help you encode that semantically. And so again, they have no meanings. We have, I think there are about close to 100 different phonemes worldwide, but English uses only 45. And then you have the second unit, which are called morphemes. And these are the smallest unit too, but they are meaningful. These are the smallest meaningful units of speech, such as, or in language, such as, like, and they do include like the simple words, but they also include, and this is very important for you to remember, prefixes and suffixes. So for instance, let's say we have the term farm. And farm is made out of 3 phonemes, meaning we have the F, right? The F. Now remember, these aren't phonemes, are not letters. These are sounds. Remember, phonemes, phone. So we have F, which would include the sound that the F makes, right? And then we have the R, right? The sound that these two make, because we don't sound them separately when we make this. So it's F, R. It sounds like if it were one R. And then we have the sound that the M makes, so So if we break it down by sounds, F, R, M, we have 3 phonemes. Now, how many morphemes does farm have based on the definition I just gave you? Hopefully you said that it had 1, because the smallest unit here that contains meaning would be farm, because fa doesn't mean anything relevant. Now, I know it's a musical note, but in terms of this particular term, how we're using it does not carry any meaning, does not add any meaning to it. Now, let's say I added the ER at the end. Now we're talking about a farmer, which is a person different from farm. It adds so it's a person that works at a farm, right? So now here we have so now here we have 2 morphemes, because we changed the meaning of the word to an individual who farms. So we have the morpheme farm, and we have the other morpheme adds meaning to farm to refer to somebody who works at a farm. And then grammar, try to remember it as sort of the broadest of these components. It involves the most, just trying to give you ideas to go from the smallest to the largest one here. And every language has grammar, and it's basically a system of rules that determines how sounds and these words can be combined. There are certain rules, and that's grammar. For those of you who study world languages or Latin, have a grasp of what grammar is and what it entails and how it is applied. And so these words and sounds in order to communicate meaning, they need to follow particular rules. So let's practice this again. So let's say the term bat on your slide. For English speakers, we use 3 phonemes to pronounce this term. So we have the b, a, t. So that bat contains 3 phonemes. And for that, same thing. Now, remember, we don't pronounce t, that sound of the T does not come through when we pronounce the term. Therefore, it's a letter, but it's not necessarily a phoneme. Actually, the way we pronounce it, the smallest unit here, it goes with the H to do that. So then we say that. So it contains also 3 phonemes. So remember, phonemes, phone relates to sounds, not letters, and it's not the same thing as syllables as your slide explains. Another example for morphemes is, as we did with farmer, we have the word readers. So how many morphemes does the term reader have? Well, we have read, and then we have ER. As with the farmer example, it adds meaning. Now we're talking about someone who reads. And then if it's plural, we have, so we have read, which is the action of reading, refers to the verb. Then we have the ER, which adds meaning to that verb. And so now reader becomes a person that reads. And S adds further meaning because now we're talking about plural. So again, readers would have 3 morphemes. Okay, within the grammar aspect of these components of language, we have 2 terms that we need to understand and need to know how to apply. These are semantics and syntax. So as you might say there, semantics are the rules that have to do with linguistics, that relate to how words and signs and sentence structure are used to communicate meaning. I'm sure in your English classes, you have had to study, for instance, the tone of the author. Or you might have to determine, I know in my Spanish classes, I always emphasize the importance of understanding context. So how the words are being combined in order to transmit or to communicate, let's say, sarcasm or news that is very serious. So the way the author for these articles or the way we write anything, we are thinking about how are we combining these words in order to communicate meaning. Sometimes sentence structures can, depending on how a sentence is structured, could be basically we are addressing somebody or we are talking about somebody. And again, these rules, like commas and the punctuation, can change differently. Can change the complete meaning of an idea. So semantics have to do with the way we use meaning and the interpretation of words and the structure of sentences in order to communicate an idea. Has to do. So the key term, operative term here is semantics is meaning. And then with syntax, it's also related to grammar, and these are the set of rules. This syntax is the set of rules that regulate the order in which words can be combined into grammatically sensible sentences. So again, this has to do with word order and how we place them. Remember subject, verb, predicate. These rules that we learned in grammar school or elementary school, these rules they were teaching us, or we were learning syntax. This is an excellent example provided by Noam Chomsky, who you should know by now, is a psycholinguist. He works at MIT and is one of my academic heroes. Noam Chomsky on grammar uses this example to distinguish between syntax and semantics, and I think it's worth giving it some thought. So we have this sentence: colorless green ideas sleep furiously. This sentence would be, so I encourage you now to quickly decide whether if its syntax is correct, semantics is correct, without looking at the slide below. And then hopefully you were able to identify that this sentence has correct syntax, meaning that the verbs, the nouns, and the adjectives are all placed in the right place. Remember, syntax has to do with the order of terms in order to communicate meaning, but still the idea does not make any sense because the semantics, the words we are using in order to, the choice of words, are not appropriate to communicate meaning in this case. The idea is not getting through. So again, I'll repeat, syntax has to do with the order of words, and the words themselves that we choose, those have to do with the semantics. Now that I'm thinking about this, I would say semantics, think about when you study a foreign language and you learn vocabulary, you are learning new semantics. That's just sort of a quick way of encoding that. So vocabulary associated with semantics. Syntax, when you have a grammar quiz or when you are learning grammar in a foreign language, you are learning how to place the the order of terms in order to communicate meaning clearly. Okay, what about in this sentence? The sentence says, rapid bouquets deter sudden neighbors. Now, what is wrong here? Does it have the correct syntax, or does it have the correct semantics, or is it faulty in both ends? Think about this one. And what about this exercise? And this question. Okay, so to the question, how do we acquire language and what is universal language? First, we need to step back for a second and understand that, as you might know, young children are pretty quick in acquiring language of others around them. I see that with my kids, and I'm sure my parents saw that with me. And we always have this idea, which is correct, that if we learn a language when we are children, we will be much better at it. Now, the reason why I bring this idea up, which is of popular knowledge, first of all, it's true. And this is going to make sense once we discuss the different positions of how we acquire language. Now, something that your textbook does not explain is that there are different sides. It does explain it, but I want to emphasize or clarify that there is a debate about how we acquire language. On one side, you have the nativists, or let's say the evolutionary psychologists of linguistics, that say these nativists, or with a very evolutionary-based perspective, say that we have a biological predisposition for language, meaning that we are wired already to learn language. And while on the other side, we have, this approach, behaviorists, that say that we actually acquire language and develop it by modeling the sounds we hear around us in order to create words. So there is no debate about the sequential stages of language, which we're going to talk about, language development, which we're going to talk about in a bit. But let's talk a little about this debate. So on the nativist side, or on this side that argues that we already are wired to learn language, we have Noam Chomsky. Again, he's a psycholinguist. He's a linguist too, and a political activist. You can already predict, what side he is on the political spectrum, but that's not relevant right now. He has argued that we are born with that our brains are pre-wired for what he calls universal grammar. Now, this universal grammar is a universal grammar of nouns, verbs, subjects, objects, negations, and questions. And he compares this pre-wiring for language as he compares it to a language acquisition device. Now, write that down. He compares his theory of universal grammar states that we are pre-wired for universal grammar. Now, this term of universal grammar comes from the fact that all languages that have been studied, I think there are close to 6,000, all of them have these basic building blocks, these basic structures of nouns. All of them have nouns, all of them have verbs, all of them have subjects. And we are born, therefore, we are pre-wired to learn them. And this is why children are ideal to sort of absorb this language without necessarily, yes, of course, this is, once they are exposed to language, these switches are basically, he sees them like switches that are basically turned on as soon as they are exposed to it. It doesn't require them to model these terms or words or repeat them in order to learn them. It's like they just get it right there, or they're very quick to absorb language. And then again, this argument, on the other side of the spectrum, we have the behaviorists that say that we learn language by imitating those sounds that we hear around us as children. And then you have another point of view. So we have let me just summarize here quickly. You have on one part of the spectrum, you have Noam Chomsky with his universal grammar, which is this idea that we are born with a wired device that just absorbs language very quickly, explains why we, without any grammar instructions, we use grammar correctly as kids. We don't say words just mixed up as a word salad. We actually use subject verbs. We pick that up very quickly. So Noam Chomsky's view on this universal grammar, this idea also comes from the fact that he argues this evolutionary pre-wiring, or the result of evolution, that we are pre-wired to absorb languages, and the fact that every single language out of the 6,000, I believe, that have been identified so far, all of them have something in common, which is we use these same grammar, the basic blocks of grammar, which are all these languages have nouns, all these languages have verbs, and all these languages have adjectives. Those three things, the fact that no matter where you are born, that your language that you speak will have these three basic components, supports the idea of Noam Chomsky that, because it can't be a coincidence that everyone in the world holds these same things in common. And those are the things that catch the eye of evolutionary psychologists, and therefore they gives more support to their opinion that we are many of our behaviors and our traits and our predispositions come from an evolutionary or adaptive standpoint, has an adaptive utility. So again, Noam Chomsky, you have on one extreme, and whatever language it'll be, we will readily learn its grammar. And we will go also, he's found that not only will we use these building blocks, nouns, verbs, adjectives in every single language, no matter what language we are born in, but we also begin speaking with nouns. That's important to know for our development. Infants, when they begin to speak, which we're going to talk about that in a minute, they begin speaking with nouns. And then they move on to verbs or adjectives. But we begin with simple things. We say car, or we say TV, or we say table. And any of you who might remember, I don't think you will remember yourselves, but any of you who have been around small children can have seen this, that we begin sort of the same sequence no matter where you are born. And then you have on the other spectrum, as I mentioned previously, you have on the other side of the spectrum in terms of language development, you have behaviorists that say that no, that language is just simply a product of exposure and modeling of the people around us, that we model the phonemes and the morphemes of the people around us. And that's how we learn, and we are corrected, we are rewarded, reinforced, or we are punished. And then we have the social interactionists, not in your textbook, but we have sort of in the middle, the moderates that combine both. We are pre-wired to learn language easily, but this socialization and interaction with people around us, what we call social agents in social psychology, are necessary for the development of language, and the shape or the proficiency that we achieve in language development will depend greatly on these social agents or the people after whom we model these morphemes and phonemes and grammar itself. So now we begin with stages. I strongly suggest that you try to, if you're a visual learner, please make sure that in your notes you have charts, because for instance, I say this because for me it's difficult to learn and memorize and understand try to retrieve information when it's in stages. So please put in practice what we've learned in this unit to help you remember these and help you study for the exam. Okay, so before we begin with early acquisition, it's important to distinguish that the different stages we are going to talk about are going to be according to the type of languages we are referring to. Your textbook explains that there is one thing called receptive language, and there's another type of language that is called productive. Pretty self-explanatory with the terms, but let's repeat. Receptive is that ability to understand what is said, and then it's the ability to understand what is said about you, to you, and about you. And in productive, language is basically your ability to communicate verbally, orally with others around you. So let's begin with receptive. As stated in the slide in front of you, we are born without language as newborns. Around 4 months, though, while still we are not there with language, we do, as part of our receptive language development, at 4 months, important milestone, you need to know this, so please make sure you begin associating the time with the milestone. The milestone at 4 months is that we begin to differentiate speech sounds, and very curiously, we begin also to understand, we are able to read lips at 4 months of age. And they've known this by studying babies and the reaction to, let's say, an image or video in which somebody is speaking, but the audio does not correspond, is out of sync with what they're saying, and they sort of become more attentive, meaning it's strange to them. We're going to see these types of studies in developmental psych. 4 months, ability to distinguish speech sounds, and ability to read lips. Then we move on to the next milestone. The next milestone as part of this receptive language development is 6 months. And at 6 months, our milestone for receptive language is that we begin to recognize object names. So an adult that tells an infant of 6 months, they can tell them, oh, ball, and they will see the ball, or they will look at the ball or try to find the ball. And they begin to make these associations of sounds and objects. Oh, that is a cup. Every time my dad or my mom or my caregiver says cup, that means this. And then at seven months, something very curious happens, and it is that infants actually have the ability to segment spoken sounds into words. And they do this, and I have to honestly, for full disclosure, tell you that I don't understand exactly the process. I don't think you too, but it's like when we perceive others to speak. Remember in class I said when we perceive others to speak faster than people in our native language, it's because our inability to, I left some space here on purpose to chunk that, right? So hopefully you remember that. Well, babies can, actually. And how do they do this? Not because they understand the meaning of words and they can divide them. It's because they statistically, they're like computers. Babies can statistically see a pattern, detect patterns in language. And so they say, oh, words end with this sound. Usually words begin with this sound. Don't ask me how exactly they do this. It's a mystery to me. But yes, this occurs at 7 months. So now this brings us to the stages of our productive language, our ability to produce oral sounds in order to give words meanings, to say them, to mention them in order to communicate our thoughts and ideas to others. So we begin with a stage that is actually not included in your textbook, and that we're going to call, number 1 is sorry, I'm not very good at writing with this, but it's called the cooing stage. And it's named after the sound called the action of cooing. So it begins occurring between 2 and 3 months. During the first month, it's only crying. Then 2 months, around 2 months, they begin laughing. Actually, babies are not born with this ability. They learn it later, or they express it later. But at first, it's only crying. Then at 2-3 months, they begin cooing. That's the first stage of language development. These are sounds that are characterized mostly by the syllables A, E, O, and either by extending one of these syllables, A, E, O, like an O, ah, or by combining them like ah, E, O. So I know it doesn't sound at all, but I'm not doing it justice, but hopefully you get the point for the purpose of this instruction. So, all right, first stage, cooing. And then, so let me put 1 here. And then the second stage will be babbling stage. And during the babbling stage, well, babbling consists of duplicate syllables. We're talking about these syllable units are usually being repeated, like ba, 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 or da, 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 da. I know, again, severely self-conscious here, but that's the sound. And 2 things are important about the babbling stage. One of them is that this occurs as your book frames it, like this occurs before nurture kicks in, meaning that even trained experts, if they hear a baby or an infant, I should say, an infant babbling in Caracas, Venezuela versus someone in Moscow, or Johannesburg in South Africa, they would not distinguish what's the native language of the household where that baby lives, where their infant lives. And that's important because it provides more evidence to Noam Chomsky's theory that we are all born with this ability to babble. We are all born with this pre-wiring that leads us to babble in same manners, no matter where on earth you are born. Again, providing more evidence to this universal grammar point of view that we are basically born with this language device. So again, infants during the stage spontaneously utter sounds that are not related to their home language. And the other one, these syllables, I forgot to mention before, are usually consist of pairings of consonant and vowels. So that ba, 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 or da, da, da. I won't repeat that again, I promise. And the other one is that these movements, the reason why these are the sounds that emerge, or this is the way babble sounds like, is because they consist, and your textbook explains this part, is that they consist of very simple movements, whether it is sort of bringing your tongue to the front of the mouth, in case of the D as in Denver in A, or T as in tomato in A, ta, 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 da, da, da. Or it's another movement that is basic, that is opening and closing lips, and that's where the mama, that's why mama or papa are very easy for them or achievable for infants at this stage. And let's agree that it's at 4 months that babbling begins. Another thing that is important here, those are those are important aspects of this stage of babbling. Oh, sorry, I forgot to mention one thing, is that babies at this stage, it's not explained in textbook, but they attempt to imitate sounds. It is in the babbling stage where they first start to imitate sounds around them. Then an important milestone, not stage, that occurs at 10 months. Again, please write these in a chart in an organized way so you have a clear idea of what age the child is, or the infant is, or the toddler is when they reach a particular milestone. At 10 months, then now here, the language spoken at home begins to have its influence on the child's speech. Basically, someone trained to identify patterns of speeches and babbling can now see that that without the exposure, basically these infants, without the exposure to another language, they lose the ability to discriminate and produce sounds outside their native tongue. So here's when we begin seeing the influence of nature in language development. Okay, so then we continue with these stages. At the age of 1, on our first birthday, we reach the holophrastic stage, also called one-word stage. So I'm going to write this one down because it doesn't show up in your textbook. So remember, but I have seen it on the AP exam under this name. So it's the holophrastic stage. Hopefully it's clear enough. You can Google it to double check the spelling of it. So the holophrastic, or the one-word stage, is basically because a holophrase means one word. We as children have already learned that words carry a meaning, that they're not just random selections, random sounds that are just existing to exist. Now, at this stage, at the one-word stage, words may not be pronounced very clearly at the very beginning. I can give you an example. One that comes to mind right now is my son. My son Bolivar, his sister's name is Clara. A name is a word that carries a meaning, right? So he would call her by, so instead of saying, Clara, come here, as an adult would say, or come here, please, he would say basically, Tata. So T-A instead of Clara, her name. Now for him, that one word signified Clara, meant Clara, but he was saying it in a different way. What I'm trying to illustrate with this example is that the fact that we realize at this stage that sounds carry meanings, words carry meanings, does not mean that we pronounce them, that our productive language is clear enough as that of an adult or a teenager or an older child, in fact. And then you know, the words are also basic in their structure too. They don't carry many syllables. And one more thing is that we don't, at this stage, the child not only mispronounces terms, like the example I just gave you, but also uses one word, but they truly mean another one. A typical example is a toddler, a 1-year-old toddler pointing to the door, but instead of saying door, he or she means, it says go. But why is he's calling the door go, basically? So he's not mentioning door, he says go. Why? Because he has seen people go through the door and associates that term. It's a one-word phrase, meaning perhaps he or she wants to go through the door, or wants to go outside, and says go to connote all that idea. That's why it's called a holophrastic stage, or a one-word stage. Or that could be a way of using just one word, but instead, again, the child wants to say door because truly he wants to say let's go through the door to go outside, but instead says go, and thinks that he or she has been very clear in that communicating that idea. Again, holophrastic stage, one-word stage, 1-year-old. At year 2, at 2 years old, we reach the 2-word stage, and this one does have also, it's a 2-word stage, and it includes, or the type of speech included here is what they call telegraphic speech, which is basically, it's characterized by 2 words, hence the 2-word stage denomination, but also it's important to know that usually this 2-word phrase involves a verb and a noun. So at this age, we see children saying things like eat cookie. So instead of saying, I want to eat a cookie, they say eat cookie. Again, telegraphic speech characterized by the use of a verb and a noun, 2 words generally. It happens between 2 and 3 years of age. Usually girls begin speaking at an earlier time than boys do. So boys would be more reach this stage more at the age closer to the age of 3, and characteristic of the stage is also that the child's vocabulary begins to expand significantly, and then sentences also begin to expand exponentially. That leads to the following stages. And before we go on to the next stage, it's important to mention that, again, Noam Chomsky comes up at this stage, meaning that children begin to place basically adjectives before nouns if they are raised in English-speaking houses, and those raised in houses where Spanish is primarily spoken, they also put the adjective but after the noun. So to say White House, the Spanish child would say Casablanca. Now Chomsky says that this is the product of the ease with which our brain is already wired to acquire language. The fact that there's such an easy understanding of from the child to use syntax, which is the rules we use to convey meaning based on the order they are placed in a sentence or in speech. Okay, so then at the age of 3, there's not a new stage here, but before we reach elementary school, before we begin our schooling normally at the age of 5, this is not the same thing as daycare, but schooling as being, taught, academics, we begin to take classes. in preschool. Before this, though, at the age of 3, so remember, we begin to what is called, we begin to do this. We begin to over-regularize. And I'll tell you in a minute why this is important to know. It's not in your textbook. And again, you will be asked about over-regularization. I hate to pronounce the term. I always get a little self-conscious there. But it's basically being too strict with the grammar and applying it to everything. An example of over-regularization at the age of 3 is when irregular verbs are conjugated like regular verbs. For instance, I goed to the store. My daughter, in fact, I think not so long ago told me, "Oh, Dad, what was the first class that you teached?" Putting the ed at the end instead of saying taught, and goed instead of saying went. These, if you think of it, yes, they are mistakes, but it's because the child is applying a rule of grammar and they are overextending its use to verbs that are exceptions to that rule. So now why is this relevant? Again, it's giving more evidence to Noam Chomsky's idea of this device, this universal grammar, that we are wired to learn it easily. And the fact that children without any instruction apply these rules to all the words is sort of serves as more evidence to his theory. And just to give you a definition for it, so you can have in your notes, is it's basically over-regularization. Oh man, it's hard to pronounce that word. Is basically when the children apply grammatical rules without making the appropriate exceptions. In this case, the regular verbs, and not applying the rules for regular verbs and all the other verbs, and not making the exception for irregular ones. And then after this stage, we go on to elementary school, and then here, remember that idea of language developing from simple to complex. It's as language develops further, children become able to express more abstract ideas and to go beyond the physical world around them to talk about their feelings. And then they begin using the if to imagine, to create situations because before that, it's all about the immediate surroundings. And then it becomes more expansive, and it becomes more about not necessarily having the stimuli in front of the child in order to talk about it. They begin to create, again, hypothetical situations. And this is how, again, language is acquired and how it develops. One thing that I forgot to mention is that in an elementary school, part of this development includes then children before elementary school stage, let's call it, after schooling starts, they don't understand double meanings of sort of jokes. And then later, that is a complex ability, again, that we might take for granted, but we cannot at this stage. It's actually quite complex for a child to understand meaning. To give you some psychological research based on this is, to a child a child that doesn't understand sarcasm, which is in a way sort of mean joking, it requires certain abilities that perhaps a child before elementary age cannot understand and can only, again, refer to or understand based on their immediate experience. Meaning for sarcasm, you need to really look at the context, see how you evaluate tone. And before elementary school age, children are simply not able to do this. Just as an example of how language develops and becomes more complex, both in our receptive understanding and our productive oral language production. So now we move on to the concept of critical periods in language development in this case. Critical period has a general definition related to developmental psychology. And it's this idea that we all have, there are particular times in which a skill or an ability will be most readily acquired, or basically, in other words, that there are times in our life, in our development, that if we don't meet a milestone or we are not provided with an environment that is conducive to reach a milestone, then sort of like a train that we lose, we no longer will be able to, or we will never acquire the skill or ability as easily as if we had done it in the time that it was meant to be acquired. It's explained in your textbook. This idea, we trace it back to Noam Chomsky too. And in now its relationship to language is that he proposes that Noam Chomsky says that there is basically that if as children we are not exposed to language before the age of 7, that we will never master that language. Now, I need to clarify, and please understand this. By mastering a language, it means native pronunciation and fluency. So, of course, some of you might say, wait a minute, I started studying Spanish when I was 9 or 10, and, I'm a pretty good student. I'm in an advanced class, etc. Yeah, and that is the case. But in this case, mastering a language means that you speak like a native speaker, and you understand like a native speaker, and you write like a native speaker. So, going back to the concept of critical periods, age 7, if you haven't been exposed regularly to this language and haven't practiced, the child will not be able to master it, reach that native language level of proficiency and understanding. Now, this idea goes further, Chomsky goes further, this is not in your textbook, that if a child for, let's say, and these are usually cases in which the child either is incredibly isolated from the world, sort of severe neglect, but if a child is not exposed to language at all, or very little of it, before the age of 12, then that child, that person will basically grow up within an inability, or with the lack of the ability to communicate, to use language to communicate. Basically, it will be disabled to learn language at all. And then, of course, I wanted to add that our human ability to absorb language is quite great, and it basically makes us human. And our tremendous ability, right, that we're wired to absorb language can make anyone learn any language. We are prepared, at least physiologically, or where our brains are prepared to absorb it. However, after a critical period, this explains why, as much as we study a foreign language, if we began studying it after 7, then most likely we will speak with an accent. And it will be very difficult. I see this with very complex tenses of the subjunctive. To use them spontaneously requires an immense amount of work. Yet for a child, without any instruction, if they are exposed to the language before the age of 7, it comes secondhand to them. It's very, very easy to absorb. And again, more to this evidence of Chomsky's theory of universal language. The language development in children who are deaf is, we can also see the importance of critical periods with them, the impact that these early experiences have in language development. One of them that we need to understand, that you need to know, is that native deaf children that are born deaf or that are born to hearing or non-signing parents, and that learn to sign language after 9, never learn it as well as those as earlier in life. Similar to adults that learn how to learn a language after puberty do not reach a native fluency level, what they call, or your textbook names, mastery, levels of mastery. Furthermore, those who learn signing as teens and adults may master basic structures and order, meaning semantics, but they never reach the native mastery level. So the important thing here to remember is that critical periods are extremely important in the development of language, because when children are isolated from language at a critical time, during these critical periods, then they become linguistically stunted. Oh, by the way, it's important too. Your textbook also highlights the fact that deaf children born to deaf signing parents develop language skills at the same rate as hearing children of hearing parents. Again, this is mentioned in your textbook, but I would like to highlight that you understand that fact as well. And speaking of which, another thing I would like to highlight from your textbook is, as we know, psychology studies how our environment, how our behavior is explained by our experiences. And this idea, it's important at this point to reflect upon what your textbook explains about the difficulties or challenges that people with hearing loss or that are deaf experience themselves. So please pay attention to that. This is the part where it explains, I believe, living in a silent world, about how many people live with approximately how many people live with hearing loss worldwide. Well, I would not ask the number, of course, but to understand the magnitude and to understand how these conditions lead to particular behaviors or conditions, further conditions, I should say. So remember, there's, the hearing loss is a spectrum. It goes from being profoundly deaf to simply suffering from hearing loss. And then you have, you have people that are deaf, within the deaf population or that have suffered a complete hearing loss. You have those that are born deaf and those who have known the hearing world or that have, due to an accident or to other conditions, have lost their hearing. And so we have this diversity within this group. It's important to note that. It's also important to know how this relates to their social worlds. For instance, children, these conditions have their own challenges. School achievement, if children that suffer from hearing loss, profound hearing loss, or who are deaf, generally and go to a school with other hearing children that are not suffering from hearing loss, they may school achievement may be compromised, may suffer. So because, logically, as your textbook also highlights, most academic subjects, if not all, are designed or rooted in spoken language. And teens as well may experience being socially excluded, which is actually quite a harsh experience during teenage years, as this can lead to low self-confidence. That's important to know. And then they have contrast these experiences with teens who have experienced teens that have experienced hearing loss, but that are surrounded, that have group of friends or that attend schools in which they are sharing with other teens with hearing loss. They have found them to have higher self-esteem as they feel more accepted. So these studies and these observations had led to sort of this cross psychology, the findings that are relevant for social psychology as they involve exclusion versus acceptance conditions, and among itself what we're studying right now, which is language development. Even adults experience challenges. So usually, especially with those who have suffered hearing loss later in life, and that are not wearing or using hearing aids, also experience social isolation. They tend to be sadder, even depressed sometimes. They also experience exclusion that is caused by irritating people. As you know, it could be a frustrating experience to try to communicate, and then people become impatient. So as Myers explains very well through his own experience with his mom, I believe, if I remember, that they tend to prefer to just seclude themselves instead of going through this exhausting experience of trying to communicate and risking these awkward social situations. So this is something important to take into consideration when studying language development as well. Let's not forget sign language is also, of course, considered to be as much of a language as spoken language. Okay, now understanding relating now to what areas of the brain are in charge of language. First, we need to understand what aphasia is. Aphasia is a disorder that is caused usually by damage to one or more of the language areas of the brain. What are these language areas of the brain? They're located for most people in the left hemisphere, in the cortical areas. Cortical areas are the most outer part of the brain. That area that we first think about when we think about the word brain. So think about left hemisphere, cortical areas. Much of this cortical area located in the left hemisphere, I'm repeating it for additional rehearsal for you guys, is in charge of language. Now, within these areas that are in charge of language, it's important to understand that these areas that are not clearly defined for us, if God forbid, someone suffers from a stroke, it is that particular area could be in charge of one of the many subfunctions of language. So within speaking, let's say, which is a function of language, perhaps this area is in charge of monitoring volume of voice. Or it's in charge, or there's another area that might be affected that is in charge of pronouncing words correctly. There is another one in charge of vocabulary. In fact, it gets as specific as there are specific cortical areas in this left hemisphere for most people that are in charge of verbs. When we mention active verbs versus nouns or emotional words that carry out certain emotions, etc. So the point here, the takeaway is that it's quite complex. You need to know within this. So what you need to take away from this or understand and memorize is that the cortical areas in the left hemisphere of the brain are in charge of much of this area is in charge of language. Within these areas, one of them is the Broca's area, that is in charge of the muscle movements of our mouth and all the muscles that are involved in producing language and speaking. And you have the Wernicke's areas, as in Wilhelm Wundt, pronouncing that W as a V. The Wernicke's area is in charge of the function of understanding language. So when we hear other people speak, we can understand what they are saying. Granted, they are speaking a language that we are familiar with or a native language. Then the Wernicke's area is the one in charge of us. Thanks to the Wernicke's area, we can understand what is being told to us. There's no need for me to repeat, but please pay close attention to who Paul Broca was. Of course, this area is named after him. And so he was the one who sort of realized that damage to this area led to certain impairments in speech. Like they had trouble speaking, modulating, moving their mouths, all the muscles involved, in mouth, out of mouth, in order to produce speech, which are many, as though it might not feel that way. But they could carry out other abilities, like singing or writing or reading. Yet they couldn't produce speech. So again, this goes back to this point that language is very complex, that it has many sub-functions. So within speaking, we have many sub-functions. Writing, we have many sub-functions. And each of these cortical areas, many of them are in charge of, are very specialized of these abilities related to language. Wernicke, same thing. Pay attention to Carl Wernicke, explained in your book. He also discovered this area, or proposed the definition of this area, Wernicke's area, that is in charge of understanding others, that allows us to understand spoken language. In terms of the location, I don't think these illustrations are the best, but please notice that the Broca's area is located more towards the front part, the frontal lobes, and sort of more towards the superior part of the brain, or posterior part of the brain. It's located above the Wernicke's area. The Wernicke's area, you will see if you contrast both of these pictures, the Broca's and the Wernicke's areas, you'll see that the Wernicke's is located more towards the temporal lobes, or more towards further down in terms of the graph illustration that you're seeing right there. Okay, now quickly, Broca's area. Damage to this due to a stroke or injury leads to Broca's aphasia. Now, remember, I just explained, in your textbook explains that aphasia is an impairment in language due to damage or injury due to a stroke or an accident in one of these cortical areas related or in charge of language. So if by any chance a stroke leads to damage in the Broca's area, then the person will have difficulty with speech, and so might understand what other people are saying, might be able to write and be able to read, as long as these areas weren't damaged as well. But this specific area in charge of muscle movement that are involved in speech would not be functioning properly, and therefore this person will be diagnosed with most likely Broca's aphasia. Wernicke's area, same thing. Please contrast those graphs as I told you, those illustrations. Now, with Wernicke's area, same thing. Let's say this, someone suffers from a stroke or an accident, and this area results damaged or affected by it, then this person might be able to speak or move the muscles related to speak, but will not understand what is being told. Now, pay attention close to this. The Wernicke's area is sort of our, if it impairs not only does it impair our understanding of what others are saying, but when we speak, if you think about it, we too are we think about what we want to say, and we edit as we go along. But if we don't even understand what we are telling ourselves to say, then our speech is going to be also hindered. Now, not because the muscles are impaired, that's Broca's area's responsibility, but because we cannot, it is as if we cannot not understand ourselves either. So people who have Wernicke's area speak clearly, but usually usually the syntax and the semantics are compromised. So people would have a very erratic speech in which in which they basically are not making any sense. I'll try to send you guys some videos with both of these conditions that I think clearly demonstrate. So it's really important to review these to have a clear idea, because just in theory or by reading them and hearing them, we don't get the clear picture of how these conditions, impairments play out in the real world. So just remember quickly, Broca's aphasia is the inability to produce language due to the effect that it has on the areas that control muscle movements related to speech, the muscles related to speech. And Wernicke's aphasia is damage in the Wernicke's area that usually results in the inability to comprehend language comprehension, but this inability to comprehend language includes ourselves, not being to understand ourselves and not being to see that we are speaking things that just don't make sense, and therefore it compromises speech too, but in a different way, more basically towards the use of semantics and syntax. So then, as we reach the end of the module, another question that this module asks is how the connection between language and ideas, how language affects the way we think. We go back to that very first question I asked at the beginning, this sort of chicken and egg relationship that these two have. And yes, thinking does affect our language, but there are different theories that you need to know the name of them and what they consist of for this unit. So yes, thinking does affect our language, as I said, which then our language also affects our thoughts. So basically the answer to that egg and chicken question is basically both affect each other. Benjamin Whorf, please remember him. He relayed him to his theory, his hypothesis of linguistic determinism. It's this very radical idea, radical hypothesis. It's on one extreme that says that our language guides or controls, basically determines our thinking. And he thought that, that basically, depending on the language that you use, can cause people to view the world differently. So if you speak English, you're going to view the world in a particular way, even within accents, within the same, and vocabulary within the same language is going to basically change too the way we see the world. And your textbook explains this very well. For instance, there's a tribe that I believe their language does not have past tense verbs, and they find it difficult to think in terms of past or something like that your textbook explains, and which provides compelling evidence to this extreme argument. So remember that, and not that I abide by completely by this theory, but it is very powerful. If some of you are fluent in another language, you might understand why that our personality slightly changes. It's not that we become complete different people, but we do change significantly depending on the language that we are using. Because some words don't translate into other languages. So there's a sense of self that varies depending on the language that we are speaking at the time. The criticism to this is that it's too extreme, and so remember this term, unsymbolized. Well, one of the arguments that says that linguistic determinism is too extreme is that is this idea that we have thoughts that not necessarily involve words. We think about things that we don't know the name to, a particular shade of color, or that I'm stealing that example from your textbook. And this is what we called unsymbolized thoughts that we don't know. Perhaps no. There are two arguments. Sorry, one of them is that we think about things that we do not have the vocabulary to describe. That's one thing, and then we also have unsymbolized thoughts. Thoughts that not necessarily have an image attached to them. And your textbook also gives a perfect example, like when we worry about what can happen. Let's say, I think the example they give in your textbook is two men carrying a brick. What can happen if the brick falls? So we're picturing, we're worried about something. We're thinking about something that we're not necessarily picturing. It's sort of predicting the future. So basically these two ideas contradict in a way that we need language in order to think in a particular way, and that there's this very inflexible approach that is linguistic determinism. So a more moderate view, it's also explained in your text, is linguistic relativity, also called the linguistic relativity hypothesis, and basically that our thinking is relative to our cultural language, and that that language affects thoughts, not that it controls thoughts. And yes, language does affect our thoughts. I don't need to repeat what's mentioned in your text. These tribes, there's another tribe in Papua New Guinea where since their language has specific vocabulary to describe different tones in yellow, therefore they, because they have this vocabulary for this, they are more aware and more specific about, it's not only just one tone of yellow, which we might be more towards that, and that we see basically, we don't see much difference in yellow as much as they do, because their vocabulary is built with specific labels to each shade of yellow. More to this, and your textbook explains it as well, is that once we label things, then we're able to notice the differences among them. So, again, this graph becomes relevant. Please read it carefully because it explains powerfully this linguistic relativity hypothesis. Relativity hypothesis that language affects, does not control our thoughts and therefore our behavior. And then at the very end of your module, explains also the process of visualization, this idea that we think sometimes in images and the power of thinking about images. So please read the study that they did in terms of outcome simulation, and then the outcome simulations versus process simulation. I can tell you right now, it's basically this idea that we think in images and how powerful this connection, this idea of thinking in images is, and that there are two ways. One of them, for instance, how it can lead to success. And so, yes, and I'm sure you've heard, it's pretty much in vogue lately, this idea of thinking and focusing on your end goal in order for one to achieve it. But the studies, I can tell you right now, but you need to read the details in your text. I'm just bringing your attention to it, that there is a distinction between what they called outcome simulation, which is, again, focusing on the end goal. And then there is a process simulation, which is thinking in images, the process that would lead you to succeed in something. And so they've done these studies with, I think, introductory psychology students, and sort of checking to see who scored better on the final exam or on the midterm. And they found that those students who visualized themselves carrying out the processes leading to the outcome, the final outcome, which is to get a good grade in introductory psychology in their undergraduate year, they those who thought about all the processes, everything that they need to do in order to achieve that goal, earned better grades, significantly better grades than those who simply visualized the outcome, who did the outcome simulation, which is basically picture the end goal, me getting an A+ in the class. That's all for now, guys. Thank you.